This lecture is on boundary evidence. This is a new module for legal aspects, and I've taken some time to craft material as thorough as I could be. It's a little bit longer than a lot of the handouts, but it's a broad topic and one that's very important to the boundary surveyor. We're not really talking about the rules of evidence in court because that would generally be in context of admissibility and would be a legal question, but later on we'll cover the rules of evidence and how they affect land surveyors, our testimony, and our work product. So it's the boundary surveyor's job to recover and evaluate evidence of the boundary being surveyed. That's a broad topic and can mean a lot of different things. So particularly, we're looking at our own property. But there are also evidence matters that we will find along boundaries. Sometimes we will find conflicting elements. So the surveyor has to have a skill set that's beyond that of the average layperson as far as recognizing and understanding boundary evidence. And it's not only physical objects and conditions on the ground. It may be information found in legal descriptions, old plats, maps, records of all types. Prior surveys can also establish some sort of geospatial reference to the corners that can be used to verify or reestablish missing corners, such as bearing a distance or a distance to a culvert, a certain tree. I've even saw church buildings, houses, and post offices used as tie points for old descriptions. This is still especially not uncommon in the headright sections of Georgia, where there are fewer what you might call established tie points or points of beginning available. The proper evaluation of the written and the physical evidence of boundaries is basically one of the most primal things that set land surveyors apart from everybody else who thinks they're surveyors or would like to be surveyors, or that directly or indirectly survey or purport to survey lines, such as realtors, a lot of property owners. Some GIS professionals definitely seem to think they know a lot about property lines. Building inspectors. I've known of building inspectors to go out and say, I think your lines are right here, so your setback is 25 feet over here and you're too close. Well, that building inspector has no business estimating or determining or declaring where the property line is. Yet these things do go on. Another form of evidence, before we get into a more detailed discussion, is parole evidence. Now, it's pronounced like you're out of prison on parole, but it's not spelled with an E. Parole evidence is generally verbal or non-recorded, non-official evidence or statements made by people who have some general knowledge of the boundaries or the corners. This might be a prior owner, it might be a neighbor, an adjacent owner, a prior adjacent owner. In some, especially rural areas, but you'd be surprised how often we find it even inside developed cities, old cities. Sometimes the descriptions are just poo. We just surveyed a tract in a city to where this is a very odd occurrence, not something that's very common, but our subject, the legal description was a tax parcel because it had been sold at a tax sale and changed hands using the tax parcel as a property description. Now, this probably warrants a whole nother discussion, but the adjacent properties also, this is what was odd. It's not uncommon to have a legal description that refers to a tax parcel, especially if its title is rooted in a tax sale. But all three adjacent owners also had their descriptions as tax parcels and tax sales. Well, tax parcels are, as we've discussed, not adequate, not precise boundaries. They are indefinite boundaries. So indefinite means they're not definite. You can't go put them on the ground. So you have to maybe make a stab at where the tax parcels had them drawn, but get everybody's agreement, or do the best you can and say that boundary line agreements are needed. But parole evidence can often correct that. Say somebody who owned the property 5 owners back may still be around, may still have knowledge of the boundaries, and may say, yeah, it used to go right over here. I've literally, in these vague and compoundingly ambiguous corner descriptions, been able to find someone who can walk me right over and show me a pipe or an axle or a planted stone. So, you know, these are non-physical evidence necessarily, the parole evidence. And also, aerial photography, especially historical aerial photography, as relates usually to large tracts or locations of prior roads or water courses, can be great evidence as to where the property lines are. We'll first speak of natural objects because they're generally understood by the law to have the higher um, hierarchy, the higher importance, because they are being natural, they are less susceptible to being moved or counterfeited. So the most common natural object that I've seen as a corner would be a tree. And we'll talk more shortly about trees as evidence, marked trees as evidence. But trees may often be used as corners, especially in older days. It's obviously not that common in current times, unless a computed corner falls in a tree. But then the tree is the effect, not the cause. But trees were very plentiful, they were convenient. Nobody had to carry a tree out into the woods and drive it in the ground. Nobody had to carry a bag full of trees. The trees were there. You would usually hack them, mark them, blaze them. And so let's talk about that. A blaze is when basically a chop goes in or along a tree and takes off a chunk of bark. Maybe in one spot, one chop. Sometimes they would do it all the way around a tree to make a band of blaze. And this would take the bark off and expose the pulp of the tree. Now, this would often kill a tree because then the pulp is exposed. It gets actually diseases, can get weakened. It can impact the flow of sap and affect tree health. So not only for visibility, but also to try to protect the bark, good solid tree resin paint is used to basically seal the pulp and protect it while making a permanent blaze. Now, once a tree has been blazed, you cannot unblaze it. You can't pull it out of the ground and move it somewhere else. The only way to get away with a blazed tree is to cut it down and destroy the evidence of it, or to cut it down and haul it off. A blaze is permanent. Sometimes bark will grow out over a blaze. Generally we'll try to, but over many years it may make a big knot that just looks like a big scar, like where a person has been cut. So, blazed trees is a very permanent object because of that. Now, some people didn't like blazing it. Maybe they'd heard that blazing a tree kills it, and obviously if you are putting a lot of stock in a tree to be a property corner, you don't want to intentionally kill it so that it's gone in a few years and rotted and all you got is a stump out in the woods. So easier and as an alternative form is a hack or a chop, and that's just more of a vertical or slightly angled chop through the bark into the pulp. Because it goes all the way through to the pulp, it'll generally scar and leave a permanent indication of where it was hacked, but it's less obvious than a blaze. And a lot of timber companies all around the state of Georgia, very often they would blaze an X in a corner tree. And it goes along with the old saying, if you've heard it, X marks the spot. And it's important to realize too that when another tree falls or a limb falls against a tree, it's often going to make contact. Tree bark is a very low friction, a very high friction surface. It'll usually tear the bark off and create an exposed pulp, just like a surveyor's blaze. So I have saw a few times to where naturally scarred trees were misidentified as blazed trees and held or claimed as property lines or property markings. So surveyors need to be really diligent in looking at that. Like if you've been around a whole acreage tract and you only find one blazed tree, you didn't find one blazed tree, that's just an outlier. If you're finding them at every corner or along the line, then you get a sense of how the person who marked them and what you're looking for. Sometimes trees were not blazed or hacked or marked, and maybe they had a ribbon tied around them, like before plastic flagging, ribbon was just that, like you'd put in a girl's hair or around, someone, like, or around wrap a present with. So um, that was not permanent. It might stay around for a long time, especially if it had some kind of glitter or tinsel. It might be visible, but it's not uncommon for a deed to call for a certain 4-inch diameter red oak. Well, you have to think about the date or the general range of the year when such a description was made, and try to estimate how big that tree would be today to know what you're looking for. If it was 60 years ago, if it's even still there, it's not going to be 4 inches in diameter. One of the more perplexing situations is where a line in a description calls for so many feet in a general direction, not a very precise direction or a precise distance, to a certain blazed maple tree or to a red oak on the side of the road. And there's 10 red oaks on the side of the old roadbed. So they can become ambiguous, and it's not uncommon for, some trees live hundreds of years. Some trees get struck by lightning in the prime of their life, and all evidence of them is gone in just a matter of years. I've done surveys where accident scenes related to trees falling on cars, and the accident was, like I just recently did this, the accident was only 3 years ago, and apparently right after the tree fell, it was piled up, and it was a pine in middle Georgia, but it had deteriorated so that the stump was barely visible. And this was not on purpose. This was just naturally occurring. And a lot of this has to do with the soil type, the chemistry of the soil, the water moisture, and how much rainfall it gets. Can have big factors on how dead trees deteriorate. Sometimes I have been involved in just a couple of cases where foresters or arborists or various tree specialists will come out with a special core drill that will remove a round cylinder through the heart of the tree so that the rings can be counted, because a tree adds a ring every year. So if it's got 87 rings, it's 87 years old. The seasonal change of the weather causes the bark or the pulp to harden and the sap to undergo a little bit of a change that changes not only the color but the density of the pulp in the wood. So sometimes you have to count trees. I saw where there was like a 1910 description for a fir tree, which is in the pine family, along a stream. And everybody said, well, here's this big tree. This must be it. And people were arguing over, was it this tree or that tree? The one that was larger was not exactly where you'd expect it to be based on the old surveys and legal descriptions, but there was about 50 feet of fluff floating around, and it was on kind of the fringe of that 50 feet. More towards the middle of where the likelihood would be of the corner was a smaller fir tree. But we come to find out that that tree didn't even come into existence till around 1924, so it could not have been the tree that was there in 1910. Not only would it need to be there, but it would need to have been big enough for somebody to consider it an applicable tree to be used as a property corner. There's also situations of where, is it a spruce, is it a fir, is it a pine, is it an oak, is it a sourwood, is it a gum, is it a hickory? And in my generation, a lot of people just knew what kinds of trees were, mainly because we cut firewood, and we knew that gum tree and sycamore and hickory was hard to split. Sycamore and poplar popped a lot when you burned it, so we learned that we liked a nice straight red oak and white oak. In this current era, knowledge of trees has to be learned and is specific, and that's something we touch on a little bit later, but just know that there are full college classes on dendrology, which is the study of trees. But it's important to know everything that you can about a species of tree if you're trying to find a certain type of tree as a corner. Of course, aside from boundary surveying, doing tree surveys, you want to do that, but I've gone to where I just get an arborist to come classify all the trees, because with tree points and tree credits being worth hundreds if not thousands of dollars, misidentifying a tree can get a city citation, a stop work order, and incur all kinds of damages. But that's another topic. The best example I can give you of nicknames and different names for trees is some of them are even the same tree. For example, a red oak is also a scarlet oak. A lot of the original landlocked notes in Cherokee County, I don't mean around Canton, I mean north of Fulton County all the way to the state boundaries. A lot of those district surveyors call them scarlet oaks. A lot of them call them Spanish oaks. I do not know the history of why it's called a Spanish oak. And because they're more prevalent in the mountain areas, some surveyors from outside the mountain areas would call them mountain oaks. There are also oaks that look very similar but actually have distinct differences, like live oaks, pin oaks, and water oaks. So just be aware of that, and you don't have to worry about it if you're not trying to identify it. Another natural feature are streams and ditches. Now, boundaries related to streams and ditches are riparian, which we've already covered. And you say, well, the ditch is not a stream. Well, it is when it rains. It's a drainage feature. Generally, the courts will view a ditch as a riparian boundary. And, a sudden change, you go back to the old. A gradual change, you just go with what you're looking at. Sometimes a spring head may be a corner. Fence, especially if they're dividing up a huge acreage tract between family members or for an auction or something, they'll say fence north to the spring. Well, that seems simple enough. Wherever the water's coming out of the ground, that's the spring. But then that can be argued. And the springs can move, actually. They migrate if they're used or if they're impacted. Or I even know of a spring that literally moved about 70 feet and popped up on the other side of the foot of a hill after an earthquake. Obviously, there was some sort of internal shift inside the ground that moved the water course of the aquifer such that it came out of the surface somewhere else. So springs are often, we call spring heads where we see base flow, where water's permanently, or at least at that moment, flowing in a ditch when it's not raining. But that can just be where the water table intersects with the ground. And so as the water table goes up or down, the point along the channel where the water comes out moves with it. A challenging feature that you may see called for an artificial or a natural feature is a draw or a valley. A gully is generally a ditch, but a draw or a valley, just similar to a ridge that we'll talk about, is it might be generally 50 feet wide, but one corner of it's lower. Do you go with the middle of it? Do you go with the lowest point? And often you're going to try to determine what previous owners or surveyors have recognized. And if not, you'll have to make a judgment call. Is it the low point of the valley, or is it the middle of the valley? And like I said, a lot of that comes maybe to context within the deed. The opposite of a ditch or a stream is a ridge. That's a high point, and that's where water sheds off in both directions. These are usually very pragmatic, common boundaries. Historically, ridgetops were of very low value because they were hard to get to, a long way from utilities, steep, hard to build on, and impossible to graze livestock or cultivate a field on. So the ridgetops were of the lowest value of the whole farm. Now, with view property being at a premium in mountain areas, it's the opposite. And being that we're talking about the whole state, I'll try not to dwell too much on mountain aspects, but having surveyed in roughly 100 of our 159 counties in Georgia, I can say that it's not as rich in terminology and differences as the mountain areas. Usually the rest of the state is fairly consistent. Other than coastal areas, we'll have dunes, salt springs, salt marshes, and swamps a whole lot that you don't find in the Piedmont or the mountain regions. And although it's not very common in Georgia, especially over around northwest and northeast Georgia, like Raven Gorge or Tallulah Gorge up in Raven County, there are gorges that are just almost vertical shears, and you've got a channel in the middle like the Tallulah River. You have a lot of this over around Cloudland Canyon in northwest Georgia, over around Lookout Mountain. And where property has been divided around these, typically people will just go to the gorge or to the brow or to the I've seen it called brow or rim, and sometimes crest, but brow is the more common term. And that's generally just where it falls off into the gorge. I've heard people say that's where you can't stand up anymore. But that's also gradual. It's usually not a flat, just a 90-degree, like walking off of an elevated wall and it just drops off. It's usually goes from being flat to kind of steep to really steep to near vertical. And a lot of times the property at the bottom is sold to the face of the gorge or all the way up. In other words, sometimes they leave accidental gores because they're not actually describing or claiming the actual face of the gorge. And these are more common in other parts of the country like Tennessee and Kentucky. Rock outcroppings or naturally occurring rock formations are favorable for property corner usage, and they would have also been used because they were pragmatic and available and already there. But they they're less common where you got a lot of rock outcroppings, even though they use trees in some areas where there are a lot of trees. Rock outcroppings are kind of distinctive in areas that don't have that many. Down near the Ocmulgee River, for example, there are some rare shoals, which are rocks in the riverbed where the river cascades over them. And that's a distinct feature that's called for in the Bibb-Monroe County line, is certain shoals at a ford or at a ferry. There's another one a few counties to the southeast of Macon, northwest of Dublin or north of Dublin, that where you've got this large, slow-moving Blackwater Creek, and then there's this rock. Makes me wonder if it's a meteor or something, because there are no other rocks the size of a Volkswagen around, but there's one in the middle of this creek, and it was used as a property corner. And it was the subject of a title insurance claim and a boundary dispute, and I kind of chuckled when I said, "Oh, a rock in a river, wow," or a rock in a creek. It was actually about a 20 or 30 foot wide creek. And they said, "No, actually, it's pretty evident, and it's a really good corner." And sure enough, it's just this rock the size of a Volkswagen in the bottom of a very shallow 20 foot wide creek, the only rock within sight. So it serves a purpose there. Artificial objects and features, those are things that are, artificial means formed or created or placed by man. So we'll come back to monuments separately, even though they are artificial objects. We're going to talk about non-monument things. So we'll start off with changes in the Earth's surface that include activities that leave a permanent effect. And all of these, for the most part, artificial objects and features were not created as boundaries. They became used as boundaries as large tracts were subdivided. And it doesn't even have to be a large tract. It could be a 2 or 3 acre plot in the city of Athens. Then they would use some of these natural features to divide property. And so we'll talk about some of them that you may run across. Roads and trails, or any type of path, is a common artificial feature used as a property line. Again, it was commonly known. People knew where it was. Two brothers sitting around trying to decide how to divide their daddy's farm in 1942, or might have been off at war in 1952. They might have said, "Well, you take everything on the west side of the road, and I'll take everything on the east side of the road." Yeah, sounds pretty good. We'll save the expense of surveying. The west track's got some good timber. The east track's got some good pasture. The one that liked to graze cattle got the east side. The one that liked to cut timber got the west side. Everybody's happy. The old road was used as a property line. Now, it may be in use. It may have become a county road, or it may have been a county road at the time. But roads might often be used. And it's important to note right here that even though roads may move and migrate a little bit through weather, but more than likely through maintenance, if it's scraped and graded and maintained, what you might call the center of the road may move every time, may move several feet over a period of time. And I talk about this in the handout. I saw where there was an old public road, and this is a common scenario. I'm just thinking of one in particular not far from where I'm sitting, where it was a 2-lane highway until somewhere around World War II, after World War II, when they started building new post-road projects. And from the flat part of the roadbed that could have been driven on, including shoulders, was about 30 feet wide. Now, they built a new straight paved highway along it, and the old 2-lane road was kind of crooked. The new road straightened it out, so there's chunks of it on both sides of the road. This creates issues of where somebody owned it to the road and now that property has been severed by the new road. They may have a little pocket of property on the other side of the road that goes to the old road bed. But what I want to talk about is these old roads, sometimes they're still used because they're practical, because they're there. They don't require to be graded and leveled out of sloping ground. Or if it's in soft ground, they've already been compacted by years of use. And so they'll go from being a two-lane major road to being a single-lane trail. And they'll usually meander from one side to the other. And surveyors will make the mistake of locating that road as the property line. If the deed was described or the description was made when that was a functioning two-lane road or a wide one-lane road or whatever, it's the middle of the roadbed at that time. Not where it is today, not where Jeepers are using it today, but it's the middle of the evidence on the ground being that roadbed. Artificial drainage features may be used as boundaries. Like many other features, they were usually convenient and practical, and they would include drainage ditches, where people built ditches to concentrate the flow, levees, mill runs, and even storm drainage features. So, in a lot of low-lying areas all over the state, people would often dig ditches or almost like canals through them to lower the water table below the top several feet of the ground so that they could be grazed with livestock and cultivated for crops. And so these deep ditches would often become good pragmatic boundaries. I'll leave you that 30-acre field over on that side of the ditch. Works for me. The ditch is there. There's no need to describe it very much. It's that part lying north of the ditch, or however it was done, but a ditch may be used that way. Sometimes rather than having this big open ditch for cattle or children to fall in, or as one person corrected me and said, cattle, children, or drunks, they would tile it. And this took me a while to understand what they were talking about, but reinforced concrete pipe came along before corrugated metal for the most part, and they came in chunks, which people call tiles. They still come in, in certain length, uniform length sections that are linked together like a male-female joint on each end, but people would use concrete pipe to tile their field. They'd put these pipes in these ditches and then cover the ditches up so that the water that they're trying to manage is deep underground. So sometimes the ditches would be tiles, and so those piped channels would be used as property lines. Levees, we drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry. Well, they're not just around the Mississippi River to control flooding. I saw levees in hill and mountain country just where people wanted to divert storm drainage from coming into a house or a parking lot or a field area or a garden. And sometimes you might just consider them to be nothing more than a berm, but a berm in fact is basically a levee. And sometimes because it's an obvious physical feature that has different use patterns on one side than the other, they would be used as property corners or property lines. Mill runs are basically diversion ditches that you find not in the flat country but in the hill country. You didn't actually find them in the mountains very often. It's more in the hill country where if you've got, just take for example, you've got a stream with a 4% slope that's dropping 40 feet every 1,000 feet. They might divert it, build a big diversion, basically a big levee, dig out, creating a channel and build up the low side with the material that you dug out and create a big diversion swale basically along the side of a hill. And by doing this, this wouldn't be very flat. The force of the water coming into the mill run would keep it moving because gravity wouldn't that much, because you might flatten it to 1 foot or 1% or even 2%, so that where the topography brought the mill run back to the mill where the mill would be placed, a big water wheel that would turn, that would be used to make electricity in some cases, but usually just to grind corn and grain up for consumption. That's what the typical mill has always been. Well, by doing that, you may get 20 or 30 feet of difference between where the mill run has the water and where the natural stream is. So then they would just run it off, basically usually on a wooden platform of some kind, where the stream would then just go and run on top of the water wheel and turn the wheel to grind the corn, make the electricity or whatever. And so mill runs would often be used because they didn't want, if they were still in use, they didn't want to disturb it. So it was like a stream, you left it alone. But it was not a stream in the riparian sense. We already talked about storm drainage structures. Often they might be used to reference, beginning at a point 80 feet from a certain culvert under the highway. Sometimes they would just say, let's just go from the culvert, we know where it is, let's go 500 feet down the road from the culvert. So the culvert became not only a corner or corner reference right there, but an accessory monument to measure the frontage from. Utility structures are also artificial, usually not placed as property corners, but they can be used. I saw where, let's just go to that power pole, Jim. Okay, let's use that as a dividing corner. Can we do that? Yep. Everybody knows where the power pole is. That's what we want to do. We want to use that power pole and hinge a 20-acre cutout. So they're there, they're available. The only thing you got to make caution for is if there's a storm or over time, they'll replace the power pole and they'll stick another one next to it. So if that's a new corner, you might want to identify it with the tag that they put on it. And there's a common misconception by a lot of average people that think that property lines coincide with power poles. There's a reason for that. Generally, that's where the power company wants to put them so that they can run a service line from the power pole to two different property owners instead of having to set yet another power pole. But and they'll normally try to, but it's more effect than cause. It's not, that it was put there for that purpose. There are timber lines or edges of fields, even in where all the property is wooded. If the people knew forever where the property line was, maybe it wasn't that well marked, or maybe they knew where it was, maybe it was a straight line or where they thought it was. Might not even be straight, but party A would cut their timber every so many years over to where they knew they were on the neighbor's property, they'd stop. Likewise, that's where the other neighbor would timber a few years later. And so you can pick up a distinct difference in the form of timber. And this is often more visible in aerial photographs taken during the green time of the year than anything. Another attribute that you might see is where, a timber line or a clearing line, edge of the woods, edge of field, where the field stops and the woods start. Now, these are not precise lines like between two rebars. They're imprecise, just like a ridge if you read the material. But it's a common, visible, acceptable, common sense boundary that people would often use. So again, these type features were usually created for their own use and later adopted as boundary elements by property owners as they conveyed. So we'll talk now about line evidence, which is evidence that was left to specifically mark property lines. Not just, we'll use that as a property line because it's there, but okay, here's a property line, now we want to mark it, we want to indicate it. We've already talked about blazed and hacked trees. That's very common. The old rule was, if you can stand on the line and reach a tree, you marked it. You blazed it, hacked it, painted it, flagged it, whatever. If you couldn't reach it, it's too far from the line. Think about it. There has to be a limit. You don't want to be flagging a tree 20 feet off the property line. People get all out of sorts. But if you just mark trees within 3 feet of a line, and then you look down the line, you get a pretty good idea. Right there's the line, and be probably within a foot. And that's the goal, is to leave it marked so that people know where the boundary is without having to have an expensive fence or something put in place. And more commonly now, instead of blazing it, we'll flag it. A lot of people will just tie the flag and put the knot where they would put a blaze or a hack. And surprisingly to me, maybe it's generational, a lot of people don't want their trees blazed or hacked. I've literally had clients call and ask if they could take the flagging down now because it bothered them. They know the property line's over there in the woods somewhere. They don't care, but that pink or that yellow or that orange flag, and it's just obnoxious. I'd just like to take it down, please. So, in the days of rural America and even some areas and some people still, they want to see their lines marked and blazed and painted where it'll be nice and permanent. Other people don't care anything about it. They're not walking their lines. They're not cutting firewood. They're not hunting all the time, so they don't really care. Besides flagging, you can stake it. Sometimes people want it staked for a fence. That's typically, they may specify every 100 feet, every 50 feet, or my favorite is just within sight of each other. If you can go 120 feet and see from stake to stake, so can the fence contractor. Other evidence that's used that might be placed to indicate a line would be posted signs, no trespassing signs. And it's not in the material, but also, I've had large landowner clients, a few of them have custom signs made that says Flint Timber Holdings, property of, or boundary nearby. U.S. Forest Service and the state of Georgia, Corps of Engineers, we've all done, or we've done, survey projects for all of those agencies, and they have their own metal signs that they want placed along the boundaries. So these are other forms of evidence that's artificially placed to specifically mark the property lines. Now, another physical element of boundaries that's not purposely made like a hacked line is occupation. Often people occupy to their property lines, whether that's where they cut the grass, that's where they built an old fence that's gone now, maybe they built a wall along the property line. I've saw people plant a row of trees, and you think, well, that row of trees, that's beautiful, that was definitely made, those trees are unusual to this area, there's 12 of them in a straight line, that's the boundary. Well, probably 3 feet, 5 feet, 2 feet, 8 feet, some uniform distance off of the boundary, where the trees would always be on the owner's property, and they were planted as a buffer. Don't make the mistake of thinking, oh, there's a row of straight trees, that's the property line. No, that's indicative of the property line. Usually, hedgerows, turn rows. Again, there are. We talked about timber lines and cultivation lines, but there are also a lot of urban areas where people built right up to the property lines, and you'll have two buildings that literally join each other. Regardless of the distance in the deed, that line where the buildings meet, usually a mortar joint on the face of a building, that's where everybody's accepted the line to be. And on one side is my brick and my building. On the other side, an eighth of an inch away is your brick and your building. So, there are lots of different elements of occupation that you'll find. And when you find adverse occupation, where people have been possessing, that gets into adverse possession and unwritten rights, which we'll cover later, but that's something that you need to be aware of. If you're trying to retrace a deed that's a tax parcel or a bounded by description, or that's very crudely written, occupation may be your very best friend. And if you cannot interfere with occupation, you're probably not going to start a lawsuit or a fight. Now, for that discussion on monuments. Monuments are artificial boundary evidence, artificial objects, but they deserve their own discussion, their own subchapter, if you will. Now, thinking somewhat chronologically, stone piles were used as landmarks and to mark boundaries as far back as the Old Testament. You can find where people piled rocks to mark their boundaries, or to mark where something happened, or to mark where we came across the river so that we can come back for generations and know that. A lot of section corners in public land states are rock piles, or they're rock piles piled around a wooden post because they knew the wooden post would eventually rot away. A lot of original corners in meets and bounds states and meets and bounds areas of our states were set as rock piles, as well as a lot of landlocked corners and section corners. And it's because they took some effort to pile them up. There was no practical reason to pile up a bunch of large heavy rocks in the woods other than to mark a boundary. And it made a statement. Oh, there's a rock pile. That must be somebody's property corner. If you know you're in the vicinity and you're looking for your property corner back when everybody owned 160-acre land lots, well, if you found it, you were a lot closer than you were before. And people usually respected rock piles. Besides just rock piles, individual rocks or planted or stones were often used. And usually when a stone is placed as a property corner, it's referred to as a planted stone. It was planted in the ground, not like a tree, but it was placed in the ground. Planted is just the term that you see, not placed. And so this is what was used for years, for a lot of landlot corners, in the original landlot surveys, stone placed, planted stone set, those sort of things, because they didn't have metal to carry, and rocks were never, they might run 9 miles in a day. They didn't want to carry anything metal 9 miles. Rocks were usually close enough that they didn't have to carry them very far. And so they would often scribe, scratch, chisel, carve the land lot number, the grant number, the grant party's name, or their initials. It's often A and W for, Aaron on one side and Wilson on the other. And some surveyors or property owners and whoever would often pile rocks, either one or more, in a straight line coming into a cornerstone and then going out in the direction of the line so that people could look at it and get a visual of, oh, the line's over here, and now it's going over there. And realize too that licensure of land surveyors didn't really start in the United States till the period between somewhere in the 1930s and the 1960s. And Georgia started licensing surveyors in the 30s. I don't remember the exact year. Tennessee enacted a law to license surveyors in 1969. So before this era of the industrial development and the post-war boom and so forth, anybody that said was a surveyor, they were a surveyor, and everybody that wanted to help was a surveyor helper. So it's not that there was a secret code or a technical standard to go by like we have now. So people were creative and people put a lot more effort into it. Now, beginning around the 20th century, people had wagons, they had carts, they had train cars and things, and so axles, spindles, shafts became more readily available, and so they would be used often as property corners. They were available, they were very permanent, they were heavy, they were hard to move. That's what people would use. They would also use mill rods. It was like a spindle that went into a big mill, and they would, sometimes they were used like ball bearings, sometimes they were center shafts for rotation. But once they were wore out or warped, or they were taken down an old mill, well, there's something that was available to be used for a property corner. Again, they were available and permanent, and many of them they still survive today. Besides pipes and spindles, all kinds of metal has been used. I have literally, with my own eyes, seen gun barrels, usually shotgun barrels, but I saw a couple of rifle barrels used. Maybe they were defunct, maybe the end of them had blown up or gotten stopped up or rusted together. It's not worth fixing. Rather than throw a gun away, we'll use that barrel for a property corner. Uncle Jed's about to give me some property. Let's go use it for a property corner because it didn't have any pipe, didn't have anything else, or because it was just neat. Lawnmower blades, car jacks, tent stakes, grounding rods. If they're near power poles, that can be real confusing. Signpost, metal fence post. I saw a large pipe wrench buried in the ground with the end sticking up. I saw large knives, large thick knives stuck in the ground, used as property corners. Exhaust pipes. I've seen all these used as property corners. And metal doesn't have a monopoly on these odd corners. I've heard of more than I've seen animal bones used. They deteriorate more quickly than people think. The heart of a pine tree is heart pine. It does not rot very quickly. It is almost indestructible. That's used a lot. I saw power poles, not just in their natural state where the power company set them, but I saw the poles used by people, farmers who have augers that dig large circles, large holes in the ground to put fence posts in. They'll set a power pole or a large creosote post or even a cross tie as the property corner, and that's hard to move and hard to mistake. But as time has dragged on, surveyors have had a hand in driving fewer of these. Maybe not everybody was a surveyor anymore, and I know in the 60s and 70s, a lot of surveyors didn't want to worry about acquiring and using a whole lot of metal. When they surveyed somebody's property, they set wood stakes, and their plats would sometimes note it. I've been told by people that had surveyors out in the 1960s and 70s that, yeah, he set stakes, and then I went around and set whatever I had, and that's how you wind up with gun barrels and car jacks and all these other things. So the location was set by a surveyor, but the monument was not. And that's why you can think, well, this can't be done by a surveyor, because I have found 6 different unique objects. They don't match, they're not consistent, but they may have all been placed right there where the stake had been used. Now, somewhere around the 1920s, roughly 100 or more years ago, industrial output picked up. The economy was good, construction began to grow, and people started having something they never had before in new homes and buildings. That was running water. That required pipes. Pipes were not always used to their completeness. There were scraps left over, and people said, wow, we can use these metal pipes as property corners. They weigh a whole lot less than an axle. And so pipes began to be used. And that can be anything between high pressure pipe. I saw 1.25" outside diameter pipe that had a 3/8 diameter hole in the middle of it. It's because some extraordinarily high pressure hydraulic fluid went through it to operate part of a power plant. They come in all sizes and thicknesses. The average water pipes are lesser thickness. Metal conduit for pipe is metal, and it's tube, but it's very thin walled. And on those, especially, not so much with water pipes, sometimes they would be cut with bolt cutters because they would cut them. Basically what they would do is pinch them in two and then they'd pop. They would have cut them. And that creates a sealed end of the pipe, a horizontal slat where the pinchers pinch the pipes together. And where they're drove in the ground, we'll recover those and call them crimp top pipes. Some people call them pinch pipes or pinch top pipes. And somewhere around World War II or afterwards, when people realized that reinforced concrete was very durable, even bomb-proof in a lot of instances, reinforced concrete construction really took off in the United States, and that required rebar. Now, they've been using it for a long time. There have been reinforced concrete structures that use rebar for a long time. But just like almost anything, rare earth materials, computers in their early days, the next generation of smartphones, when it first comes out, it's rare and very expensive. It takes a lot of use and commonality for it to be affordable and practical. And that's what happened with rebar. When construction really took off post-war, there was a lot more rebar being made. The price came down, the availability came up, and that's when surveyors would start using rebar more often. Similarly, they would use flat iron or angle iron because that was used in construction, but less than rebar. And finally, the granddaddy of concrete monuments, the most significant one that you'll find in the artificial world, is a concrete monument. Now, that in itself doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Usually, you're not going to know how long it is because you don't want to dig it up and measure it. All you can do is measure the outside diameter. The average Georgia DOT right-of-way monument is 4 inches square. I've saw some that are bigger. In other states, I've saw some that were 2.5 or 3 inches in diameter. I've saw similar monuments. In a right-of-way monument typically will have RW molded into it in the concrete form and have an X in the top. And the other end smooth that goes in the ground. I saw similar monuments but without the RW used as property corners in coastal Georgia because metal would sink in the ground, concrete was more permanent. Usually something like that's going to have a strand of rebar in it that your metal detector can pick up. It's also to keep the concrete rigid and from just crumbling and breaking. The ideal ones are not just concrete stakes or concrete posts like that, but they'll have a cap, a metal cap, usually brass or aluminum. And just like benchmarks, that'll say United States Geological Survey. They might say property corner, Jones and Smith. Usually it's government agencies and large landowners that have the funds to have concrete monuments placed that you'll find them at, but they are not uncommon. And I saw a lot, especially in middle and south Georgia and some of those large pine tracts. The concrete monuments are more concrete placed around an existing pipe or pin or rebar or axle where they formed. I've done this myself where we take old coffee cans and cut the bottom out of them and set that in the ground around a rebar, dig around it so that you could go 4 or 5 inches down below the top of the coffee can and then pour that full of Saccharine. Just leave it. You don't even have to mix it up. You don't have to stir it. The moisture from the ground and from the rain will eventually make it wet and it'll set up and harden. So, passing comment on right-of-way monuments is some of them are set very precisely. Others have been known to be paced off of a centerline station with a clap 90 and put 20 feet in the wrong place. That creates all kinds of legal issues, but these are the type monuments that you might find under the broad heading of boundary evidence. I hope you've got something out of this. Just trying to impart some of my knowledge for the next generation of surveyors. Thank you.